Introduction to Ethics. Today, in this episode, I'm going to talk about moral relativism, and in particular, one version of it which is called cultural relativism. Think of multiple different moral codes in different places on the planet or in different time periods. For instance, slavery was widely accepted as permissible in ancient Greece. And even Aristotle thought that slavery was permissible from a moral point of view. And also in 18th century North America, slavery was legally permissible, and many famous people in America at the time had slaves. So homosexuality was considered morally wrong besides being illegal until 1960s in the United States. And today it's even same-sex marriage is legal in many states in the United States. So as you can see, there are differences in approaching moral issues or approaching issues from a moral point of view in different time periods, in certain locations, or in different parts of the globe. In order to understand these differences, or in order to make sense of it, we have to understand certain concepts about morality. And this brings us to discussion between objectivism and relativism in morality. So objectivism about moral norms claims that of the opposing views, one of them is morally superior to the other. Objectivism, according to the objectivist understanding of morality, of the opposing moral codes, one of them is superior to the other, and that's the right thing to do or right policy to follow. On the other hand, we have relativism, and in particular one strong version of it, which is called cultural relativism. According to cultural relativism about morality, there is no philosophical basis to say that one norm is superior to the other. But we all know that describing differing moral norms, like I've been doing at the beginning of this session, like when we say that homosexuality was seen as morally impermissible until 1960s, besides being illegal, but after a certain period and after certain, of course, political struggles, it became widely accepted that homosexuality is morally okay, morally permissible, and same-sex marriage is even legally permissible in many states in the United States now. So describing different moral norms doesn't necessarily disprove that some of these norms are superior. So if you, by just showing that there are different moral norms, you cannot show that all these different moral norms are equally valuable. Some of them can be clearly superior to the others from a philosophical point of view. And these superior ones might give us a better version of moral truth, or might bring us closer to the moral truth. So let me talk a little bit about moral truth, what I mean by moral truth. Some moral beliefs seem to be intuitively true. For instance, it's for many people, this sentence would be very clear. It's morally wrong to harm a baby or torture a baby just for the pleasure of doing so. So if this sentence seems intuitively true from a moral point of view, then we have a strong ground to start to reach moral truth. We can take this point from a starting point. We might agree about the truth of this sentence, widely agree about the truth of this sentence, but disagree about what torturing a baby or harming a baby might mean. So we can then have a further discussion, philosophical discussion, but then we have one vantage point from where to start to reach moral truth. So, but when we talk about moral truth, what might this moral truth be like? Is it like mathematical truths, like 2 + 2 = 4? And we know that 2 + 2 = 4 was true even before it was proven to be true. So is moral truth something like this? Is it true even before we have the philosophical arguments to show that it's true? And 2 + 2 was true even if we cannot exactly show where the concepts 2 and 4 are coming from. So is moral truth something like this? According to relativists, or cultural relativists, or relativists as a wider group, this is not the case. According to relativists of any sort, there is no such thing as universal truth. Everyone sees things from the perspective of their own culture, according to cultural relativists, and time period. No one has any basis to claim superiority of their values or of their claims. So let's have a closer look at cultural relativism and try to understand what this view claims. So first of all, this claim or this view has to say that right and wrong can only be understood within a certain culture. Also, as a second premise, it has to say that, it says that it's morally wrong for a culture to impose its ideas of right and wrong onto another, because this is part of cultural relativism. But the second principle, saying that it's morally wrong for a culture to impose its ideas of right and wrong onto another, doesn't seem to be a relative view. Any cultural relativist has to accept the truth, universal truth of this view in order to preserve the first premise, which was right and wrong can only be understood within a certain culture. So the second premise, banning any culture to impose its ideas onto another culture, doesn't seem to be relative to a specific culture. Therefore, we cannot hold cultural relativism in this crude form. We need further work on it. We need to tweak it a little bit. Let's call this pseudo-relativism. This new version. Let's call this new version the pseudo-relativist version. According to this version, there are two rules that make up this moral view. And the first rule is this: it's morally wrong for a culture to impose its ideas of right and wrong onto another. And the second rule says, Rule 1 itself is an exception, and it's permissible to impose Rule 1 onto another group, culture, or individual. And if we define pseudo-relativism this way, like two rules and second rule is an exception for the relativist approach, then we can say that this is also the basis for self-determination and toleration in a liberal society. But there is a clear drawback of pseudo-relativism. Sometimes, as we all know, states harm or oppress its own citizens. A very clear example is Jews, gays, and gypsies in Nazi Germany. They were harmed, oppressed, and actually massacred. And homosexuals in many cultures today, or all sorts of ethnic minorities, can be counted as in this harmed group. If pseudo-relativism is true, then other countries will not have a moral ground to criticize these oppressive practices in a given country. Because this pseudo-relativism says that the Rule 1 is an exception. Rule 1 was saying that it's morally wrong for a culture to impose its ideas of right and wrong onto another. So you cannot criticize another culture's wrongdoing from any moral ground. So pseudo-relativism has this clear drawback. This brings us to the idea that there should be a balance between tolerance and concern for all. I mean, we want to be tolerating for cultures to impose their own values onto themselves, onto a group or individuals to impose their own rules to themselves, but we also balance this with another value which we might call concern for all. So let me say a couple of things about the general problems of cultural relativism. This was the one that I just counted was the particular problem of pseudo-relativism as I defined it a short while ago. But now let me talk about general problems of cultural relativism. So many of us belong to multiple groups, maybe a religious group or a group of belief systems, country, gender, political views, or moral views, etc. So how do we decide when the values of our groups collide? You might belong to one country which has strong moral code, but you might have a gender that's not acceptable in that country's moral code. So there is a clear collision in the values that you are advocating for yourself or for a culture. The assumption that there is one single value system in a single group is not true. So individuals do not adopt the values of a group that they belong to. They don't have to adopt individuals can adopt the values that they belong to of a group that they belong to, but they don't have to do this. So individuals or groups might have multiple values that are in collision. So this is a general problem of cultural relativism. This criticism brings us to an idea that we might call modest relativism. And according to this view, we might have two levels of morality, one for unity and one for diversity in a given culture or group or a nation. At the unity level, we have the moral core, which settles disputes and coordinates cooperation in a society. This is the unity level of any given group. At the diversity level of morality, we have different ways of solving problems. One example says some cultures burn the bodies of their dead, others bury them. So this is the diversity dimension of morality in different cultures. But any culture would agree that bodies of the dead must be removed both to dignify them and to save society from disease. doing otherwise would be morally impermissible. So, and this is the unity part. So there is some certain unity, there is some element that makes up the unity among cultures or among groups according to this approach. So there is the diversity level and the unity level. Unity just shows that cultures or groups are unified among each other according to these principles, but they might have diversity in how they apply certain principles. But again, we might have problems about this approach, although this might sound like a plausible approach. And one example of the problem would show itself when we talk about genital cutting. So let's talk a little bit about genital cutting. We know that some African tribes or some other societies or other tribes or groups apply genital cutting to young girls as a symbolic step to adulthood and a way to ensure that women will have less sexual pleasure and thus will keep fidelity to their husbands. And this can actually impose serious harm to the girl, both medically and for her well-being from any psychological point of view. This is clearly appalling practice. In defense, one might say that one might try to say that the moral core behind this ritual is shared in many cultures, and which is staying sexually loyal in marriage. One might try to put genital cutting in the framework that we have been just talking and defend moral relativism even through this example, and in defense might say that there is a moral core behind this ritual which is shared in many cultures, and that moral core says that many cultures defend staying loyal in marriage. And the objection is immediate and clear. The objection says this is not the actual moral core behind this ritual. This act applies only to women, therefore it doesn't serve to the purpose of unity that we were looking for in a modest version of relativism. So moral core doesn't actually look like it gives us some unity in this practice. And there are more values that are violated in this example. For instance, equality, autonomy, freedom from harm, or all sorts of independence from harmful practices. So we can see that modest relativism has difficulty to explain an appalling practice like genital cutting in the terms that it defends, saying that there are two levels of morality in any given culture. One is for unity and one is for diversity. And as we have seen, genital cutting is a clear counterexample, and one might find other counterexamples to this sort of defense of moral relativism. So a moral relativist has to do more in order to defend itself against these sort of counterexamples. Let me sum up what I've been talking about in this episode. I've just talked about differing moral practices in different cultures on the planet or in a given nation among the different time periods. In order to understand these differences in different cultures, we have to use certain moral concepts. We can use moral objectivism to criticize one culture or time period and say that the other one is true, but on the other hand, we can also use cultural relativism to say that one practice was right at the time. For instance, slavery was right at the time of 18th century United States from a moral point of view, and it's wrong today because this is how the culture has evolved to evaluate this practice. This might be a way of using cultural relativism. I'm not saying that this is the only way of applying cultural relativism to this example, but this is one way of using it. But then I showed that cultural relativism has to modify itself and say that, okay, there is an exception in cultural relativism. Moral values might be dependent on cultures or groups or individuals, but the rule that says that one can impose this rule, this is the first rule onto other cultures, must be an exception from relativist approach. Then I showed some drawbacks of this argument, this further developed pseudo-relativist argument, and then brought the relativist position to something that we might call modest relativism, which says that actually there are two levels of moral approach in any given culture, which includes diversity and unity. And then I further gave an counterexample to it, which was genital cutting. So this will be the end of this episode, and I'll be talking about related topics in the coming episodes.